Yesterday I uploaded a video that had to do with working in crayon, and I called it Working in Crayon Part 1, and I was demonstrating regular Crayola crayons and beeswax crayons on different paper surfaces. Now today we're going to go into working in crayon 2, but to get there we're going to spend a little bit of time with ink. Now on the table here you see 3 drawings that I'll show you in a minute, and I just want to point out some different ink types that are good to use that are permanent. The first one is vintage Schaefer script ink. Yesterday's video I was talking about how you could make your own coloring books. Now this is actually red, which is difficult to find. I also have a jar of blue-black. And Schaefer Blue Black is generally the ink I use from the vintage Schaefer inks, but also from modern cartridges for pens. This is their red, and it's really a beautiful pink red. It's a little bit hard to find now, but if you can find it. Now, you could outline a coloring book image in red, especially if you plan on obviously coloring it. You don't have to use black, is my point. Now these are Noodler's inks, Noodler''S. Now Noodler's are also permanent inks. You have to let them dry. Same with the Schaefer, they're not permanent until they dry. Now I have about 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have about 9 colors of Noodler's inks, and they come in a bottle. And these are a fountain pen ink. The Schaefer Red, the vintage Schaefer Red, is also a fountain pen ink. These are absolutely beautiful colors. I have burgundy, I have rose, this is called Navajo, which is a turquoise blue. This is black, comes in black. It also comes in a color here called Apache Sunset. And this is a yellow red that looks reddish in the bottle like mercurochrome, and yet it's like a yellowish when you use it. These are wonderful inks. They are very permanent, and they can be used just like any fountain pen ink in any of your favorite fountain pens. This is a hunter green, and this is a red. Now by using a fountain pen to draw your outline, you won't have, you know, a solid black line that may or may not be the effect you're looking for when you're doing outlines specifically for coloring. Now this is, so there are some colors, and this is called lapis, legal lapis. And this is as close to the blue-black of Schaefer that I've ever been able to find. So Noodler's Legal Lapis. And let me just show you a couple of pens. I think they're here. These are Parker's. And I have several colors of them because what I do is put a different color ink in each of the pens, and then I can tell, like this holds burgundy, the one with the pink stripes holds the rose, this is the Apache Sunset, this is the Navajo, this is Hunter, and this is a diluted Apache Sunset. So, and they're wonderful. These are wonderful pens. They're about $10 a piece. They have, most of the time they have a medium nib, They do also come in calligraphy nibs, but you would want the regular medium nib for doing this kind of work. And this is an ink converter that is attached to it. And what you would do is just hold the pen tip down into the ink bottle, move the little slide thing back up, and it would be filling the pen. Very simple, similar to a lot of fountain pens. Now, I'm suggesting these because if you're going to work in crayon, and these are between $7 and $10 a piece. The inks are about $7 for the larger bottles. I think these are $5. But what you could do is draw your own coloring book images in colors and let them dry. And then if you did this in advance, you would then have pages where you could just go and color whenever you wanted to. Now let me just move these out of the way. Another ink that is wonderful for doing this is just the Schaefer cartridges. This is a vintage Schaefer fine point pen. These are fairly easy to find on eBay. This is the kind of pen I used in high school. And just like it, I have about 5 or 6 of them. They write wonderfully. They do not take ink converters. So you have to use the cartridges in this vintage Schaefer. This is another Parker. This one is steel, stainless steel, and I keep the legal lapis in this one. Now, a lot of times what I've done over the years is use a blue when anything calls for a black, because it's a little bit less less defining. It's less, obviously it's not as dark as a black. It's more balanced, I guess, is the way I would say it. This is also a Schaefer Viewpoint calligraphy pen. This will take converters. It will also take cartridges. These are still made today, so you should be able to find a Viewpoint. These were made after the No Nonsense pens. They're styled after the Schaefer No Nonsense. And you can get Schaefer ink converters that fit a Viewpoint pen. I just recently saw some of these on Amazon, so I know they still have those available. So there are all kinds of pens. You could also use a large nib size rapidograph pen, and in fact that would probably give you very close to a commercial look for a coloring book, because these have tubular nibs that lay down an even width of a line. So you could go to, say, a size 1 or a size 2 rapidograph pen, and you could do it that way. And with those, you would have to buy some kind of technical ink. And I use, now I use FW acrylic. Now, I could probably write a book about the differences, but when you buy ink, be careful to ask exactly what the ink is meant for. If you use a fountain pen ink in a rapidograph pen, you might end up ruining the pen and clogging it because most fountain pen inks have shellac in them. Most drawing inks do not. Inks that are meant for technical pens will not have shellac in them. So that's the main difference, but you have to ask. If it's not labeled well, you have to ask. Then there's a ballpoint, and of course there's pencil. There's no reason why you couldn't do crayon outlines in pencil. So those are some of the different tools that are available that you can use. But in yesterday's video, I had also mentioned Croquill pens and Higgins ink. Now this is Higgins. Originally it was called Black Magic. Now it's just called, this is fairly new, waterproof drawing ink. And then Blick made a substitute called Black Cat, I think. Blick Black Cat. I could be wrong on those. They've changed their formulations. I've been doing this for a long time, and I don't always keep up on what they call them. But Higgins waterproof drawing ink. You can't use this in any pen except a dip pen. Well, you can, but you'll ruin your pen. So this is ink specifically for a dip pen. And let me just go grab a dip pen and I'll show you what they look like. Now, a couple of things I want to add before I go further. Here is the vintage Schaefer Script Blue Black. And can you see what color that is? It's a beautiful, literally blue black. It's just a gorgeous color. And it adds interest to a drawing instead of solid black. But, of course, it's a personal choice on what type of effect you might, want to have. Now, this is Pelican drawing ink. This you can use either with a dip pen. I think I have also put this in technical pens. But I'm not sure that you'll be able to find that very easily. I've had that for a long time. The reason I like the Higgins ink is because it is the one that is most waterproof. And if you're going to maybe use it for crayon, but then maybe you want to use it for watercolor, you can do a drawing in Higgins black waterproof India ink and let it dry. Usually overnight is best if you're going to use watercolor, and then watercolor right over it, and it stays without bleeding. Noodler's Legal Lapis, and probably Noodler's Black, but the Legal Lapis is about the same, and you can compare that with the script ink. It's a little more difficult to see this color. This has a little bit more purpley hue to it. And then there is also just regular, this is Papermate Inkjoy pens, regular black ballpoint, and Sharpie markers. You can just draw whatever you want with a Sharpie marker, give it a few minutes, and you have a black outline if you want to make coloring books. So now, if you're just starting out in drawing and maybe you think you want to go from coloring books to fine art or crayons to oil painting, you should start with this book, which is called How to Draw What You See by Rudy Derenya. Rudy, and it's Dereyna. It's the best book. I found this book many, many years ago, and what it teaches you to do is draw before you paint. And my high school art teacher, Mr. Bolton, was brilliant because I was already oil painting, and he said, now go back to pencil. And I went back to pencil, and if I hadn't, I wouldn't have learned what I've learned now. These are typical images of what you'll see in this book. And that's a face and a head, but it shows you exactly how to do that, because now when you learn how to draw that, you can basically oil paint anything because you know the foundations of the shapes. So that's the book you need if you want to take drawing or crayon further. And once you master that book, you can take those, what you learn in that book, and apply it to other materials. Now, for some reason, my bottles of Higgins don't have black in them. This is sepia. This is the Pelican sepia ink, and it's the only bottle I can find right now of Higgins ink that has real ink in it. So I think what I'm going to do, I might use a few of these, but this is a crow quill pen. Now, these are actually the holders, and this is a vintage box. You'll find them under Speedball now. Crow quill for use with number 102, 107, and 108 pens. Now, in the old days, a pen was really the nib, and this is just the holder. And you'll see the end has a hole in it, and there are two types, so you have to buy the right nib for the right pen holder. This particular one has a completely open hole, and there's another one which I think takes I think there's a 104, and that has a ball in the middle of the hole, and the actual pen point is shaped differently. So this is how you buy the nibs. You can buy them individually, but Blick sends them in a box anyway. So you need one of these, which is a couple of dollars, and you need a nib. And Speedball does have beginning drawing sets for $4 or $5. And this is what they look like. There's two of them here. Now, there's a reason that I still like these. First of all, you don't have to run out of ink. As long as you can buy a bottle of Higgins waterproof black and you have a crow quill nib, you can draw. And that would be in addition to any pencil. You take a brand new nib and you fit it into the hole and you have a crow quill pen. And when I first started, specifically in pen and ink, I bought my first crow quills at the hardware store on Martha's Vineyard because it was the only place where they sold any art supplies. And they sold crow quills and Higgins black waterproof. Now, here's an index card. And these are actually fashioned after real feathers, which are called quills. And you can cut a feather tip to be the same shape of this, and you cut a feather to have the same little slit in it and hole, and you're back in the old days when they wrote with feathers. So when they stopped writing with feathers, it was because they had come out with pen tips like this in metal. And like I said, this is the sepia ink. Now, there's a whole art, in a way, to writing with these, or drawing with them. A couple of the things that you have to watch out for are blobs. You can't shake it really. You have to let it fill correctly. When you dip it, you have to brush off any excess. I have stippled very intensive drawings in black and white with these, and that's where the control really comes in, because it's the pressure you put on the paper that controls the size of your dots. It's really going back to step one. So they're, but they're just like a ball, excuse me, they're just like a ballpoint pen. You want to have a rag with you all the time to wipe the nib whenever you need to. Especially changing colors, because ink will sometimes stay on the underside of the nib. So there is a crow quill pen. Now, if this is, like I said, an index card, and if this were, my hand's a little shaky today, if this were Higgins black, this Pelican will probably dry the same way. It's just about as waterproof, I guess. So obviously you can draw with with this. In other words, you don't get, it's not a difficult action to master. It's very easy to do. It's not like, simply because it's old-fashioned and simplified doesn't mean it's difficult. So that's a crow quill pen and a bottle of ink, and there are so many advantages to having this because Art Bin makes a pen and nib box. Let me just grab one. Now these are actually similar pens, but these are for calligraphy. And these are the C-type nibs and larger holders. But you can get a box like this by Art Bin. You can have several holders and several nibs in there. And instead of carrying technical pens, you have one box with a whole bunch of nibs. And because it's dipping into your ink, what you'd really be taking with you is your ink. So I advocate that everybody know how to use one of these, because everything else is manufactured and is going to have, well, it's not so much what they put in the ink as it is a lot of inks. They're all formulated for a specific thing, either fountain pens or technical pens, or that's why I like Noodlers, because Noodlers, being a fountain pen ink, is permanent. And that's usually the problem, is that fountain pen inks are not permanent, but drawing inks are. So, like, you can't put the Higgins waterproof ink into a fountain pen, but you can use any ink with one of these. So it eliminates having a certain pen for a certain ink. So that's the crow quill. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with other pens that you like or have, and inks that you have or like. But so those are just some examples. This is the Noodler's Lapis in the Parker. Get the name of these pens. Parker has a name for them. And that blue and brown give you a less, there's a word I'm looking for, I guess less distinct outline. So let's start first with just regular copy paper. And again, we're doing this, now I'm going to put this aside for a second, but I wanted to show you that because that's what I was talking about in my video working with Crayon 1. And they're very inexpensive. Let's start with the Noodler's Legal Lapis and straight copy paper. And I'm going to stay with a pair. A pair is really 2 circles, or 1 circle and 1/2 circle. And then you don't want to forget the stem. So there's a basic drawing. Now let's say I had cut this paper in half. I go ahead and I draw whatever I want to draw in a book. I make a 25-page book of that, and then we have a coloring book. Then you have a coloring book, and it's that simple. You can either staple it, if you did cut the paper, or even full size, you can staple it right down here, or you can put it in your antique treadle sewing machine and sew it together and have a real coloring book. So that is the outline on copy paper. You're going to get a similar effect on all other papers, from index cards to charcoal paper to watercolor paper. Now, this is newsprint that I've been using for block printing. So let's use the same, actually let's use the crow quill on newsprint, because this is where because the paper itself is so thin, this is where the control comes in for a crow quill pen. And newsprint, this is actually fairly heavy newsprint, but it's very absorbent and it's going to take the ink differently. And because this is such a pointy nib, it's going to stick in the paper. And that's what I meant yesterday when I said you have to be careful with this kind of a pen on newsprint. But that's not too bad. I thought it would bleed into the paper more. So that's not bad at all. So you can take actual newsprint and make a coloring book out of newsprint. Newsprint is very inexpensive. With a crow quill pen. And now what I'm going to do is get the crayons, and I have all different kinds of papers, but I'm going to just do some crayon on each of these, newsprint and copy paper, and we'll see the difference to the crayon. Now, here's why we're doing this. These, this is a copper point drawing, and all three of these were in copper point. And this is a copper point stylus, which is very similar in idea to a crow quill and ink, except it's a piece of copper. And again, I could write a book, but before graphite and pencil were invented, people wrote with metal. And in order to be able to write with metal, you need a surface that is going to grab the metal particles right off of your stylus. In my case, I use marble dust and rabbit skin glue. I mix them together, and I usually coat wood with them. And this, there are all kinds of metals you can write with. Silver, gold, copper, pewter, all kinds. This is a copper point drawing. Now, originally, I was saying, originally, copper point or metal point drawings were done on this surface, but not always as to be used as a finished drawing. Sometimes I guess they were. But they're really what we would use as graphite, where this is the initial drawing, and it would then be painted either in oil or watercolor on top of it. Now, copper point in particular, in my humidity, because the atmosphere comes into this, and how much they fade, what color they oxidize. Now this one is on paper on top of wood, and it has not turned brown. Normally, copper point will turn a brownish color as it oxidizes. And my problem had been with some of my copper point drawings, I've done them on different surfaces, and some of them were fading. And these two were fading out completely, and I was afraid I was going to lose the drawings. They were just going to fade out to nothing, and you wouldn't be able to see it. You have to be especially careful if you work in gold, because I've done gold drawings, and they fade almost completely. Now, that's, in one aspect, the beauty of drawing in metal, is because they look antiquish, even though they're not. So, but anyway, those two drawings were like this, only paler. And the reason this has to do with crayons is because knowing the type of surface I had that on, even though they're on paper on top of wood, they have marble dust and rabbit skin glue on them. So in my case, I usually use oil. If I'm going to go over a drawing or complete a painting from a copper point drawing, I would then use oil. So with these two, what I did was 2 oil washes in color. But when I went to finish them, I was going to, I'm sorry, I think it's a high pollen day or something. I was going to finish them completely as an oil painting. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with oil painting and what they can look like. This is one of mine right there. And you can see that that's a very solid look. So I went from a very pale drawing to wanting them to be very solid. Now because they're on paper, I did 2 oil washes, and I could have continued in oil, but I would have had to do it very, very carefully. So what I ended up doing to finish these was I went over them in crayon. And so this is 2 oil washes on top of a copper point drawing, but finished in Crayola and beeswax crayons. Now, this is why I'm bringing in the idea of blue and brown as outlines instead of black. I only added the black. You see it here around the headband, on one side over here. That's black crayon. I only added that at the very end. There's black around her eyes. Before that, it was brown and blue. And yet I felt I wanted to just give the drawing a little bit more punch. And that is where I brought the black in. But this relates to the idea of crayons in general, because what this is now going to have, it's got that copper point drawing originally. Then it has 2 oil washes. I could have also used watercolor because this would be very absorbent for watercolor. But then on top of it with a wax crayon, the wax actually seals the whole thing. And oil paint would have sealed the whole thing as it dried. And like I said, I just didn't want to lose their expressions. I've drawn these 2 many times, but I liked the copper point drawings the best, and I didn't want to lose that expression. And you know, it's kind of a funny expression. This one is called Edward, and this one is called Best Face Forward. And when I decided to put crayon as the top layer, as I was saying in working in Crayon 1, that will harden slightly, and it will seal them. And one application of painting in oil paint is to actually add wax to the oil paint. It's almost the same effect by doing an oil wash and then crayon on top of it. It's as if you were painting in oil but adding wax to your oil paint. And these kind of look cartoony now, but I actually don't mind that. There's more black on this one, and like I said, for many, many years I didn't even have black, and when I would need black, I would mix it out of other colors, other than the Higgins black waterproof ink. But you can see that even with this style, the style they ended up going from this to this, those few black lines actually give an accent to each piece, which brings the face and the expression more forward. So you can use black as a way to shape your message, is what I'm saying. So that comes in when you're deciding whether to use brown or blue or black with something as simple as making a coloring book. Now I have the Crayolas here, and I have my beeswax crayons here, and I think what I'm going to do is end this video now, and in the next video I'm going to pick one of these, or maybe both of them, and just sit down and draw the pair as if I were just drawing the pair for myself. And I probably won't talk too much through that video, but you'll be able to see where I'm layering color and how I'm doing it. But I wanted to bring these up because I probably am going to be doing the same thing with this one. This hasn't faded as much, but I also, this is called Pixie, and I really don't want to lose this one either. In fact, I have, I don't know, 50 or 60 copper point drawings that I may now go over with either watercolor or oil and then crayon. And it's a way, again, to think of crayon as much more than just for kids. So in the next video, which will be part 3, I'll show you how I layer color on a simple object. I want to add at the end here, Parker Vector. Parker does have a name for them. They're Parker Vectors. And between $7 and $10 a piece. And this one, they do come with cartridges. I think they come with 2 ink cartridges. There are the converters available for them. Usually they're marked whether they're calligraphy or not. Oh, here it is. Medium stainless steel nib. And they tell you what kind of cartridges to buy. But because I always have bottles of ink, I bought the converters. So those are Parker Vector. And these are like the cream of the crop of fountain pens. And I don't mention them a lot. They really are like the gold in the safe. Osmoroids are probably the best pens for consistent nib flow, ink flow through the nib. They're hard to find. They don't make them anymore, of course. They're expensive, of course. This is a typical lettering pen set. They're more for calligraphy. There are drawing sets that have different nibs. A set will come with 1 pen, and this one has 6 nibs. Some of the different nibs are hard to find. I have an extra fine nib in this one, which took me a couple of years to find the nib. But it writes, it's such a beautiful pen to work with. It just, well, this has been closed up. I've got legal lapis in this. And if you leave it closed up for a while, you'll have to restart it a little bit to get going. You can just dip it in water, wash the nib off, and get it going again. Absolutely beautiful pens to use. The issue with them, if it's an issue, is that they have what is called an ink sac inside, and this is a lever that you use to fill it. So same as with the Croquill or the Parker Vector, you dip the nib and into the ink, and on these, on the Osmoroids, you pull the lever out, and it's like a rubber bag in there, and you use the inflow of air to fill the pen. But because they're vintage, and this all screws apart, the nib comes out, let me see if I can get this apart easily. I just want to mention them because if you're going to do ink art, you really should have an Osmoroid. Simply because, so this is called the ink bladder, and this is the collar, and the nib screws out. And so when you lift the lever, it forces the air out of the rubber bag, and then when you let the lever go and push it back down again, it pulls the ink in. You can, there's a website called Pendemonium, and you can still get ink bladders, and they don't carry the nibs or the pens, but they do have the ink bladders, and there is a certain adhesive that's based on citrus, I think, that you need to glue the ink bladder to the collar. So that's an osmoride. They're absolutely, like I said, the top of the line for a pen for lettering, but also for drawing. You can use these for drawing. Now, they made, and this is very hard to find. You might find one in Canada, or they seem to be more common in Canada. This is an Osmoride India ink pen, and it was made and marketed specifically for using ink like the Higgins waterproof India ink. I have done that. You can do that. It still clogs. And that is why, I forget what I paid for this, but they run, the last time I looked, the last one that had sold, they haven't been around for a while, but the last one that I could find that had sold was about $100. I don't think I paid that much for it. But if you see this and you think, oh, that's wonderful, Kohinoor has one too called the Art Pen that you can supposedly use India ink in. And same thing, you can, but you end up paying a lot of attention to the pen and how the ink is flowing and all of that. When you can use a crow quill and use any ink that you want to use, as long as you can dip a pen into it. Now, crow quill, see, this is getting already, you'll get ink on the edge, and you'll end up with ink on your fingers. So you have to be careful of that when you're using it, because you don't want that to transfer to your drawing. Now, there are hundreds of types of pens, but the ones that I've mentioned are kind of like the classics in a sense, and they each perform differently, but you can interchange what they do, all of them, with crayons, either by drawing an outline, or, for example, on the pixie drawing, if I want, I can actually outline that in black. I've done religious icons like that, where I would actually outline the whole thing, go over all the major lines in black, and then fill it in with egg tempera paint. So you can, a lot of times, whatever application you're using with crayon, you're going to run into ink, which is why this video has been all about ink and what kind of ink to use, specifically with coloring books, but also if you want to do something like that. I could do the whole thing in crayon, and I would end up with transparent layers of wax. So before you go into an art store and buy one of everything, it helps to buy what's cheapest and experiment a little bit and learn about the properties, because if you want to be an artist, you want to spend your time drawing and not cleaning your pens or sharpening your pencils, or, I mean, all of this stuff is wonderful equipment to have, and I couldn't do what I do without it. But at the same time, it should be the least important thing, because the art is the most important thing. There's one other type of pen that you could use. It's called a Rotring art pen. They're also made for calligraphy, but they come in different nib sizes. You can get refills for them, and I think you can. I think I also have converters for those. And those are another wonderfully flowing calligraphy pen, and it's all a matter of how you use the tip. Calligraphy nibs are slanted because they're made for lettering, just like you see the lettering here. They're made to do that, but you can use that same effect in a basic drawing that you're then going to do something else with. So working in Crayon 3 will be actually working in crayon.